The man whose name every American schoolchild knows never actually finished his ride. Read that again slowly, because it matters. Paul Revere, the legendary hero of the midnight gallop across Massachusetts, the man immortalized in one of the most beloved poems in American history, never made it to his destination. He was stopped, surrounded by a British patrol in the dark countryside between Lexington and Concord. His horse was confiscated on the spot. And then Paul Revere, the great midnight rider, walked back to Lexington on foot, like an ordinary man who had simply missed the last stagecoach of the evening. The most celebrated midnight rider in the entire history of the United States did not complete his mission. He failed midway through. And yet for more than 2 centuries, his name has lived on as the symbol of patriotic courage, of that single, breathless night when one man on horseback changed the fate of a nation. How does that happen? How does history crown someone who never crossed the finish line? How does one man get all the credit when 2 other men were riding the same roads on the same night, carrying the same message, facing the same danger? That question has a fascinating and deeply unsettling answer. And the answer does not begin in 1775. It begins 85 years later, in 1860, with a poet named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow sitting at his desk in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a nation tearing itself apart at the seams, a civil war gathering on the horizon like a summer thunderstorm. Longfellow had a mission that night, though perhaps he did not fully realize it himself. He wanted to remind a fracturing country of the moment it had first become a country. He wanted a hero. He needed a hero. And so he built one. He built that hero out of half-truths, selective memory, poetic license, and the kind of burning romantic imagery that makes readers feel something deep in their chests, even when the facts are all wrong. The poem he wrote that night became one of the most widely read and widely memorized pieces of verse in American history. It spread through schools and parlors and 4th of July speeches like a virus. And it buried the real story so completely, so efficiently, so beautifully, that we are still digging it out today. The names of the men who were erased have barely scratched their way back into public consciousness even now. So here is what we are going to do together. We are going to go back to that cold April night in 1775 and follow the real story, all of it, including the parts that got cut out and left on the floor of history. We are going to meet the men who actually rode, understand who they were and what drove them forward through the darkness. We are going to look at the intelligence network that made the ride possible, a network far more sophisticated and far more impressive than anything Longfellow put in his poem. And then we are going to ask a question that has no clean answer. When a nation needs a myth to survive, is it wrong to give them one? Because that is what Longfellow did. And by the time we are finished, you will have a completely new framework for thinking about how America tells its own story, which heroes it chooses, which ones it discards, and what those choices reveal about who we really are as a people. This is not the story you learned in school. This is the one they left out. Stay with me. To understand why the midnight ride mattered so enormously, you have to understand the world it happened in, and that world was a pressure cooker ready to blow. By the spring of 1775, the relationship between the American colonies and the British government had been poisoned by a decade of escalating conflict. The Stamp Act, the Townsend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the intolerable acts that Parliament had slapped down in response. Laws so punishing and so obviously designed to crush the spirit of Massachusetts that they had the opposite effect. They turned moderate men into radicals, and radicals into revolutionaries. The colony was a tinderbox. Everyone could feel it. The British military governor of Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, could feel it. The Sons of Liberty could feel it. Even ordinary farmers in the countryside, men with no particular interest in politics, could feel it in the air. the way you feel a thunderstorm coming before a single cloud appears on the horizon. Gage was a careful man, cautious by nature and thorough by training. He understood, perhaps better than most of his superiors in London, that raw force alone would not solve the problem. He needed intelligence. He needed to know what the colonists were planning, where their weapons were stored, and who their leaders were. And he had informants, good ones. The identity of his most valuable source has never been definitively proven, but historians have long suspected a man named Benjamin Church, a prominent member of the Sons of Liberty, who was secretly feeding information to the British. If that sounds like something out of a spy novel, it is because it essentially was. 1775, Boston was saturated with spies on both sides, men and women passing coded messages, watching troop movements, counting supply wagons, and risking their lives for information. The city was a stage for one of the most consequential intelligence wars in American history, and most of the players on both sides have been completely forgotten. On the colonial side, the intelligence operation was run largely through the Sons of Liberty, and its most energetic and effective operative was Paul Revere himself. This is the part of the story that almost never makes it into the popular telling, and it is absolutely crucial to understanding who Paul Revere actually was. He was not simply a silversmith who happened to own a fast horse. He was a courier, a spy, an organizer, and a committed revolutionary who had been running intelligence missions for the colonial cause for years before April of 1775. He had been part of a volunteer network of men who watched the movements of British troops in Boston, counting regiments, tracking supplies, noting which officers were meeting with whom. He had ridden to New York and Philadelphia, carrying intelligence to the Continental Congress. He had ridden to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to warn colonists there that the British were planning to seize their military stores. Paul Revere was a professional rider and a professional spy long before his most famous night. That context matters enormously because it changes the nature of the midnight ride from a spontaneous act of heroism, which is how Longfellow portrayed it, into the culmination of a long, carefully organized intelligence and communications operation. It was not one brave man acting alone on an impulse of patriotic passion. It was a system, a well-designed, well-tested, remarkably effective system built by dedicated people who understood exactly what was at stake. What did Paul Revere look like? It matters to paint the picture. He was 40 years old in April of 1775, compact and powerfully built, with the strong forearms and thick shoulders of a man who had spent decades working with metal, hammering silver into shape with the kind of physical force and precision that the craft demands. His face was angular, with dark eyes that contemporaries described as alert and intelligent, the eyes of a man who was always thinking, always calculating, always watching the room. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who was very good at what he did and who knew it without needing to announce it. He had been born in Boston in 1735, the son of a French Huguenot immigrant named Paul Revere, who had anglicized the family name to Revere, and he had grown up in the North End, the same neighborhood where the old North Church stood. He knew every alley, every rooftop, every face in that neighborhood. He was embedded in it, the way only a native son can be. As a silversmith, he had built one of the most successful craft businesses in colonial Boston. His work was technically brilliant, combining clean, functional lines with a decorative sensibility that showed the influence of his French heritage. Some of his pieces are now in major American museums. Revere was also a printmaker and engraver, and his most famous pre-revolutionary work was a printed engraving of the Boston Massacre that was so powerfully propagandistic, so perfectly designed to inflame colonial outrage, that John Adams himself noted, somewhat ruefully, that it bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened. Revere understood the power of image and narrative before those words became the vocabulary of media professionals. He understood that the story you told about an event could matter as much as the event itself, which is deeply ironic, given what was about to happen to his own story. the man who shaped narratives for others, would himself become the subject of the greatest narrative reshaping in American history. By the early weeks of April 1775, everyone in the colonial leadership knew that something was coming. The signs were everywhere. British soldiers were drilling with unusual intensity, supply wagons were moving at night, boats were being assembled along the Charles River, and the intelligence coming in from Revere's network pointed increasingly toward the same two targets. The colonial military supplies stored at Concord, 20 miles from Boston, and two men, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the two most important revolutionary leaders in Massachusetts, both of whom were currently staying in Lexington. If the British could capture those two men and destroy the weapons at Concord, they might be able to decapitate the revolutionary movement before it properly began. Paul Revere had already made arrangements with a man named Robert Newman, the sexton of Christ Church in Boston, the church we now know as the Old North Church. The arrangement was simple and elegant in the way that the best plans always are. If the British marched out by land, Newman would hang one lantern in the church tower. If they moved by sea, crossing the Charles River in boats, he would hang two. This signal was designed not primarily for Revere himself, but for riders waiting in Charlestown across the river who could see the tower clearly and act immediately. It was a backup system, a fail-safe, because Revere, like any good organizer, knew that he himself might be captured or blocked. And so he built redundancy into the plan from the beginning, understanding that the mission was too important to depend on a single point of failure. On the night of April 18, 1775, General Gage finally moved. Around 10 o'clock in the evening, British soldiers began assembling quietly at the waterfront to board boats that would carry them across the Charles River to Cambridge, from which they would march overland to Concord. The operation was supposed to be secret. It was not secret. By the time the British troops were boarding their boats, the colonial intelligence network was already in motion. Robert Newman was already climbing the stairs of the Old North Church. Two lanterns were already being readied, and on the Charlestown side of the river, men were watching the tower in the dark, waiting for exactly this signal. Meanwhile, Paul Revere was preparing to cross the river himself. He needed to get out of Boston, which meant getting past British naval vessels patrolling the harbor. He borrowed a boat. He wrapped the oars in a petticoat to muffle the sound of rowing, the petticoat reportedly provided by a woman who lived near the waterfront and who handed it out her window when asked, which is the kind of detail that makes you realize how many anonymous people were part of this story that history never bothered to name. Revere and two companions rowed across the Charles River, slipping past the massive British warship Somerset anchored nearby, and landed in Charlestown, where a horse was already waiting. A fast horse, described by those who saw it as a particularly fine animal named Brown Beauty, belonging to a man named Deacon John Larkin. Revere mounted and rode. The night was cold and dark, in the way that April nights in Massachusetts are, the last breath of winter still carrying in the air. The countryside outside Boston spreading away from the road in patches of woodland and muddy farm fields that swallowed the moonlight. Revere rode hard, stopping at houses along the way, hammering on doors, spreading the warning that everyone had been half expecting for months, but that still landed like a hammer blow when it finally came. The regulars are out. Notice that phrase. Not the British are coming, which is what Longfellow's poem implies, and what generations of Americans have repeated. The regulars are out. In 1775, almost everyone in Massachusetts still considered themselves British subjects in some sense. They were colonists, fighting for their rights as Englishmen. The phrase, "the British are coming," would have been almost meaningless to them, or at least confusing. What they needed to know was that the regular soldiers, the professional military, the redcoats, were on the march. The distinction matters. It is a small detail, but small details are exactly where mythology diverges from reality, and it is worth noticing every divergence, because each one tells you something about how the legend was constructed and why it was constructed that way. But Paul Revere was not alone on that road. Here is where the story opens up and gets complicated in the most interesting way possible. At roughly the same time that Revere was crossing the Charles River on his borrowed boat, another man was already on the road ahead of him. His name was William Dawes. He was 23 years old, a tanner by trade, lean and quick-witted, with a kind of ordinary, forgettable face that made him genuinely good and the kind of undercover work the revolutionary cause demanded. On the night of April 18th, he had left Boston earlier in the evening by a completely different route. While Revere crossed the water, Dawes rode across the Boston Neck, the narrow strip of land that was the only overland exit from the city. And he did it by bluffing his way past the British Guards stationed there. He was a tradesman, he implied, through his bearing and his appearance. Just a man going about his business. Nothing to see here, move along. The guards let him through. Think about what that required for a moment. To approach a British military checkpoint in a city under effective martial law, knowing that you are carrying a warning that could be considered treason, and to project such perfect calm and such ordinary purpose that armed soldiers wave you past without a second look. That took either extraordinary nerve or the kind of cool-headed acting ability that most people discover they do not have until the moment of the test. Dawes was riding toward Lexington along the southern route, while Revere took the northern route through Charlestown and Medford. Both men were carrying the same message to the same destinations by different roads. This was not a coincidence or an improvised plan. It was deliberate redundancy built into the system by colonial organizers who understood that one rider might be captured, that one route might be blocked, and that the mission was far too important to depend on a single point of failure. William Dawes was the backup. He was Plan B. Except that Plan B was actually Plan A in many ways, because Dawes set out before Revere and covered a longer and arguably more dangerous initial route just to get out of the city. Why does William Dawes vanish from the popular memory while Paul Revere burns so brightly in it? There are several reasons, and we will get to all of them. But the simplest and most immediate reason is that Longfellow did not put him in the poem. Longfellow knew about Dawes. The historical record was not so completely obscured in 1860 that the other riders were invisible, but a poem needs a single hero. A poem built around the momentum of one name cannot accommodate two names without losing its propulsive forward motion. Paul Revere's name fit the meter perfectly. William Dawes's name fit less well. And so, William Dawes was left out. 85 years of history, reduced in part to a question of poetic meter. It sounds absurd. It is absurd, and yet it is exactly what happened. Both men reached Lexington at roughly midnight. They warned Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were staying at the Hancock-Clark House, that the British were on the march and that they needed to leave immediately. Adams and Hancock did leave, slipping away into the countryside before the British arrived. That part of the mission was a complete success. After delivering the warning in Lexington, Revere and Dawes decided to press on to Concord, another 10 miles up the road, to warn the colonists there about the threat to their military supplies. They set out together, two men riding in the cold dark toward a battle that neither of them knew was already inevitable. And on the road between Lexington and Concord, they encountered a third rider. Samuel Prescott was 23 years old. He was a doctor from Concord, young and energetic, trained in medicine through the colonial system of apprenticeship and self-study, a man with an intimate acquaintance with human suffering and human endurance that his profession demanded. He was of medium height, wiry in the way that active young men often are, with the quick movements and alert eyes of someone accustomed to being called out at all hours of the night to tend to the sick and the injured. He was also a committed patriot and a member of the local Sons of Liberty. On the night of April 18th, he happened to be in Lexington, visiting a young woman named Lydia Mulligan, whom he intended to marry. It was nearly midnight when he encountered Revere and Dawes on the road. He joined them immediately, without hesitation. He knew what the message meant. He had been expecting something like this for weeks. He knew these roads better than either of the Boston men, because they were his roads. He had ridden them his whole life, in every season and every weather, on calls that could not wait for daylight. He knew where the stone walls were, where the paths cut through the woods, where the ground was firm and where it turned soft. That knowledge would save the mission. Because disaster struck almost immediately after the three men set out together. A British patrol appeared out of the darkness, several mounted soldiers stationed along the road, specifically to intercept exactly this kind of messenger, placed there by a British command that knew the colonial alarm network existed, even if it did not know its full extent. They came out of the shadows fast. Revere was captured immediately, surrounded before he could react. Dawes managed to escape, wheeling his horse and galloping back toward Lexington, but in the confusion and the darkness, he fell from his horse and could not continue. His horse ran off into the dark. William Dawes, the man who had bluffed his way past British guards at the Boston Neck, ended the night sitting in a field outside Lexington with no horse, unable to finish what he had started. And Samuel Prescott? Samuel Prescott vaulted his horse over a stone wall in the dark and disappeared. The British patrol, unfamiliar with the local terrain, could not follow him across unfamiliar country in the middle of the night. Prescott rode on alone through the darkness, through the back roads and cowpaths that he had known since childhood, navigating by feel and memory as much as by sight. He rode 10 miles through cold April night, alone, with no backup, with British soldiers searching the roads behind him. And he reached Concord. He delivered the warning. He finished the ride. The ride that we celebrate every Patriots' Day in Massachusetts, the ride that Longfellow turned into American legend, was completed not by Paul Revere, but by a young doctor who joined the mission by chance because he happened to be out late visiting the woman he loved. If you wanted to write a movie with maximum historical irony, you could not do better than that. After Prescott escaped, Revere found himself in the hands of a British officer who interrogated him on the road. And what happened next tells you something essential about who Paul Revere actually was as a person. He did not fall apart. He did not beg or dissemble or try to minimize what he had been doing. He told the truth, or at least a version of it designed to serve his purposes. He told the British officers that he had already warned the countryside, that the alarm was out, that 500 men were already up in arms in Lexington. He may have been exaggerating. He probably was. But the message was clear. You have already lost the element of surprise. There is nothing more to be gained from holding me, and there is very good reason to be worried about what is waiting for you on that road ahead. It was psychological warfare conducted by a captive against his captors, and it worked. The British patrol released him not long afterward, keeping his horse, but letting the man go free. Revere walked back to Lexington, and there, at the Hancock-Clark House, he found that Adams and Hancock were still present, still packing their belongings, still not quite ready to leave. He helped them. He made sure they got out safely. And then, almost as an afterthought, he went back into the house and retrieved an important trunk of papers that Hancock had left behind in the rush, papers that could not be allowed to fall into British hands. That is not the act of a defeated man. That is the act of someone who kept thinking and kept working long after the most dramatic part of the night was over. While all of this was happening, a fourth rider had also been dispatched that night. His name was Israel Bissell, and his story is so extraordinary, so completely buried under the Revere legend, that it reads almost like a deliberate joke about how history works. If Paul Revere rode roughly 13 miles before he was captured, Israel Bissell rode 345 miles over the following 4 days. He carried the news of the fighting at Lexington and Concord from Massachusetts all the way to Philadelphia, riding through Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey, changing horses as they tired, sleeping for only a few hours at a time, spreading the word that the war had actually, finally, irrevocably begun. His ride was longer, harder, and in many ways more consequential than Revere's, because Revere was warning people that the British were coming, while Bissell was telling people that the shooting had already started and that the decision had been made for all of them. Israel Bissell has been almost completely forgotten. Most Americans have never heard his name. He does not appear in textbooks. There is no famous poem about him. There are no statues, no patriotic holidays, no children's picture books. Part of the reason is simple timing. Bissell's ride happened after the battle. The dramatic moment had already passed. But the other part of the reason is that Longfellow did not write about him, and Longfellow's poem became not just a poem, but the story. Not a story, the story. This is the moment to stop and think carefully about what that means. When a single artistic work becomes the primary vehicle through which a culture understands a historical event, something profound and potentially dangerous happens. The work inevitably simplifies. It inevitably selects, choosing certain elements and discarding others. It imposes narrative shape on events that in real life had no such clean shape. It turns confusion and contingency and collective action into the story of a single heroic individual. And once enough people have absorbed that story, once it has been repeated enough times in classrooms and speeches and children's books, it becomes almost impossible to dislodge. The simplified version crowds out the complex one. The legend replaces the history, and the people who got left out of the legend stay left out, decade after decade, generation after generation, not because they were less brave or less important, but simply because no poet chose to write about them. William Dawes rides through the night and bluffs his way past armed soldiers, and history forgets him because his name did not fit the meter of a poem. Samuel Prescott vaults a stone wall in the dark and carries the warning to its destination, and history shrugs because Longfellow was not watching. Israel Bissell rides 345 miles through 4 states, and history does not even give him a footnote in most accounts. The unfairness of it is staggering when you lay it out plainly. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was 53 years old in 1860. He was, by any measure, the most famous poet in America. He was probably the most widely read English-language poet in the entire Western world at that time. His books sold in the hundreds of thousands. Children memorized his verses in schools all across the country. He was a gentle, scholarly man, a professor at Harvard, a man who cared deeply about ideas and beauty and the moral direction of his nation. He was also in a state of profound personal grief and political anguish in 1860, because both the man and the country around him were in serious pain, and the two kinds of pain had become impossible to separate from each other. His wife, Fanny, had died in a terrible accident the previous year, burned to death when her dress caught fire in their home, while she was sealing locks of their children's hair in envelopes as keepsakes. Longfellow had tried to save her and suffered severe burns to his face and hands. He grew the famous beard that appears in all his later portraits, specifically to cover the burn scars. He was a man in mourning, living with disfigurement, looking for something to hold on to, and the country around him was cracking apart. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860 triggered the secession crisis that would lead directly to the Civil War. By the time Longfellow published Paul Revere's Ride in January of 1861, South Carolina had already left the Union, and 5 more states were in the process of doing so. In that context, the choice to write about the birth of the nation, about the moment when patriots rallied in the darkness to defend their freedom, was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate act of cultural and political intervention. Longfellow was saying to his readers, and particularly to those in the northern states who were about to go to war, remember who we are. Remember where we came from. Remember the men who rode through the night so that this country could exist. Remember what we are worth fighting for. It was an act of love for a nation he feared was dying, and it worked with an effectiveness that no purely historical account could ever have matched. The poem he wrote was brilliant. There is no other word for it. It opens with the narrator speaking directly to us across time, inviting us in with the intimacy of a bedtime story that happens to carry the weight of national destiny. The poem then builds with extraordinary control, creating a sense of mounting tension, darkness, silence, and then sudden galvanizing action. The lanterns in the tower, the horse and rider appearing like a ghost from the night, the alarm spreading from village to village as dawn comes. the final image of the graves of the dead at Lexington and Concord. It is magnificent narrative poetry. It is also, as we have established, riddled with historical inaccuracies, errors of fact, errors of sequence, and enormous errors of omission. But none of that mattered to Longfellow's readers. What mattered was the feeling. There is a historian named David Hackett Fisher who wrote a remarkable book about the Midnight Ride, published in 1994, and Fisher makes a point that cuts right to the heart of why the mythology grew so thick around this particular event. He argues that the ride was genuinely remarkable, genuinely historically significant, genuinely worthy of celebration, even without any mythology layered on top. But the mythology grew so large that it began to obscure the very things that made the real event impressive. The poem turned a sophisticated, collectively organized intelligence and communications operation into a one-man show, and in doing so, it paradoxically diminished the achievement it was trying to celebrate, because the real achievement was not one brave man riding alone through the dark. The real achievement was a functioning civil society, a network of ordinary citizens who were organized, committed, and ready to act, who had spent years building the systems and relationships that made rapid, coordinated action possible. That is a more complex story, a less cinematically satisfying story, but a more profound one. Think about what it actually took to make that night work. Someone had to recruit Robert Newman to hang the lanterns and convince him it was worth risking his life for a signal that might never be needed. Someone had to arrange for a horse to be waiting for Revere in Charlestown. Someone had to decide to send both Revere and Dawes by different routes as insurance against capture. Someone had to organize the Minutemen in dozens of towns and villages so that when the warning arrived, they knew exactly what to do. The alarm system that Revere activated was not something he built on his own. It was a community project, years in the making, maintained by hundreds of people whose names we do not know and whose faces have no portraits hanging in museums. Revere was the spark. The rest of the community was the tinder, and without the tinder, the spark means nothing at all. That is the real lesson of that night. Not that one brave man can change history, that a community that organizes itself and trusts itself and builds its systems carefully can accomplish things that seem impossible from the outside. American history is full of these compressions, these moments where a genuinely collective achievement gets attributed to a single heroic individual, not out of malice, usually, but out of the very human need for a story to have a protagonist. We need a person to follow. We need a face to attach to an idea. Abstract concepts, like a community organizing itself for collective action, are hard to hold in the imagination. A man on a horse in the dark is not hard at all. Every culture does this to some extent. But America does it with particular intensity, perhaps because this country was founded on the idea of individual liberty and individual action, and so it naturally interprets even collective history through an individualist lens. The Founding Fathers are presented as a small group of brilliant men, rather than as the visible tip of a vast social movement. The Civil Rights Movement is often taught through the story of Martin Luther King Jr., rather than as the work of thousands of organizers, protesters, and ordinary people who appear in no textbooks. The moonshot is remembered as the story of Neil Armstrong, rather than as the achievement of 400,000 engineers, scientists, and workers who never received a ticker-tape parade. The compression is always toward the individual, always toward the dramatic, always toward the singular moment of heroic action by a single, extraordinary person. That pattern is not an accident. It is a feature of how this country understands itself, and that pattern has consequences. It makes people feel that history is made by exceptional individuals rather than by organized communities. It makes ordinary people feel like spectators of history rather than participants in it. It discourages exactly the kind of collective civic action that actually made April 19, 1775 possible in the first place. There is something deeply ironic about a legend that was created to inspire civic courage, but that teaches, at least implicitly, that civic courage means waiting for the right hero to appear and then cheering him on. The real colonists of 1775 did not wait for a hero. They were the heroes, all of them, collectively. Now here is the moment that changes everything. Here is the twist that complicates the whole story in ways you may not expect. In the days and weeks after April 19th, 1775, the colonists themselves wrote extensively about what had happened. There are diaries, letters, depositions, newspaper accounts, all of them produced close to the events, while memories were fresh and details sharp. And in those contemporary accounts, Paul Revere is mentioned, but he is not the central figure. He is one name among many. William Dawes is mentioned with roughly equal frequency. Samuel Prescott is described as the rider who actually reached Concord. The collective nature of the alarm is clear in every early source. The speed with which the news spread, the efficiency of the system, the extraordinary response of the militia, men appearing from every direction as if conjured from the April darkness. That is what the contemporaries found remarkable and worth recording. Not one man, but the system. And then 85 years passed. And then a poet sat down at his desk in Cambridge. And then a poem appeared in the Atlantic Monthly. And then a nation that was already forgetting the details of that night and that desperately needed a clean, galvanizing story about its own origins, absorbed that poem like parched ground absorbs the first rain of spring. And Paul Revere became the hero of the midnight ride, not because the historical record supported that specific elevation above all others, but because the poem was magnificent, because the story was irresistible, because the country needed it more than it needed accuracy. And here is the twist that complicates everything further. Paul Revere himself, the real man, the one who rode and was captured and walked home and helped Adams and Hancock escape, was not entirely displeased with the credit. In later life, he wrote his own account of the ride, and in that account, he naturally placed himself at the center of the story. He did not mention William Dawes at all. He gave Samuel Prescott credit for reaching Concord, to be fair, but he largely framed the night as his mission, his daring, his contribution to the cause. So the legend did not arise purely from external myth-making. Revere himself participated in constructing it, because that is what human beings do. We tell our own stories in ways that make us central. We remember ourselves as the protagonists of our own most important nights. And honestly, who can blame him? The real tragedy of the midnight ride is not that Paul Revere received too much credit. The real tragedy is that William Dawes and Samuel Prescott received so little. William Dawes bluffed his way out of a besieged city on a cold night in April and rode alone to Lexington, and history forgot him so completely that there are people who have spent years studying American history and still cannot name him. Samuel Prescott vaulted a stone wall in the dark to escape a British patrol, rode alone through 10 miles of countryside he had never navigated in the dead of night, and delivered the warning that gave Concord time to prepare. He was 23 years old. He was a doctor. He had never been to war. He was just a young man in the wrong place at the right moment, who made the right choice when it counted. And his name has barely scratched its way into the footnotes of popular history. That is not justice. It is not even accuracy. It is the collateral damage of myth-making. And it matters because it points to something real about how we decide whose sacrifice counts and whose gets erased. Every historical moment has its Dawes and its Prescott, the people who did the work and did not get the poem. Every act of collective heroism has its anonymous members whose names slip through the cracks of memory because no one thought to record them at the right moment, or because the person who did the recording had a story to tell and could only fit so many characters into it. The midnight ride is unusual only because we can now, 250 years later, actually go back and recover some of those names. We can give them back their night. We can say out loud that Samuel Prescott finished the ride. We can say that William Dawes rode just as far and just as bravely. We can make them real again. So here is where we land, after following the real story of that April night, from Boston Harbor to the North Bridge at Concord, and all the way back through 85 years to Longfellow's desk in Cambridge. Paul Revere was a remarkable man. He was brave and organized and experienced and deeply committed to the cause of American independence. His capture did not erase his contribution, because the real value of what he did was not completing 13 miles to Concord, but activating the alarm network along the way, waking up dozens of households, setting a carefully designed system in motion so that by morning there were armed men converging on Lexington Green from every direction. He did that. He did it well. He had spent years building the relationships and infrastructure that made it possible. He deserves his place in American history. Genuinely, without reservation, he deserves it. But William Dawes deserves his place too. He was 23 years old, and he rode alone out of a city under military occupation with nothing but his wits and his nerve to carry him through. He deserves more than footnote status. He deserves a poem of his own, one written with the same care and beauty and fire that Longfellow brought to the other man's name. And Samuel Prescott, the 23-year-old doctor who vaulted a stone wall in the dark and rode alone to Concord and finished what two older, more experienced men could not, his name should ring through American history with the same resonance as Revere's. In a historically honest world, it would. In the world we actually have to fight a little to remember it. And what about Longfellow himself? Was he wrong to write the poem he wrote? Was he wrong to give Revere all the credit and leave Dawes and Prescott in the shadows? It is easy to say yes from the comfortable distance of a century and a half, but it is not entirely fair. Longfellow was a poet, not a historian. His job was to make people feel the importance and the beauty and the stakes of those events, not to produce a footnoted academic account. He succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. He produced one of the most beloved poems in American literary history. He gave a divided nation a story about its own courage at the exact moment when it needed such a story most desperately. That the story was simplified, that it elevated one man over others who were equally deserving, those are real problems, but they do not make the poem a lie. They make it human. The real lesson of The Midnight Ride is not about Paul Revere specifically. It is about how history gets made and remade, how myths arise and what they serve, how the stories a nation tells about itself shape its self-understanding in ways that can be both powerful and distorting, and how the only real antidote to that distortion is curiosity, the willingness to stop and ask the uncomfortable questions. Is that really how it happened? Who got left out? What does the rest of the story look like? What would I find if I went looking behind the poem? The men who built the alarm network in 1775 were not waiting for a hero to arrive and save them. They were doing the work themselves, in the dark, in the cold, with no guarantee of success and every probability of a British prison if they were caught. They built the system. They maintained the redundancy. They were Plan B when Plan A was captured on a dark road outside Lexington. That is the actual American tradition that April night represents. Not one man on a fast horse. A community that organized itself, trusted itself, and kept riding even after the first rider went down. So let me ask you this, and I want you to think about it seriously. Now that you know the whole story, now that you know about William Dawes bluffing his way through the checkpoint, and Samuel Prescott vaulting the stone wall, and Israel Bissell riding 345 miles while Revere was walking back to Lexington, does that change how you feel about the midnight ride? Does the complexity diminish the heroism? Or does it actually make that night more impressive, more worth remembering, more worth honoring? Because here is what I believe. The real story, the messy, complicated, multi-person, collectively organized, beautifully imperfect, real story is more inspiring than the poem. Not less, more. Because it is the story of what ordinary people can do when they decide together that something matters enough to act on. Tell me in the comments what you think. Tell me whose name deserves more recognition. Tell me whether you believe Longfellow did America a service or a disservice by giving it the simplified story it needed instead of the complex story it actually had. Tell me if you had heard of William Dawes or Samuel Prescott before today. Because that is a genuinely hard question, and there is no clean answer to it, and the conversation it starts is exactly the kind of conversation that serious history should always be provoking. If this is the kind of history you come here for, the real story behind the mythology, the forgotten names, the inconvenient details, the moments where legend and reality diverge in ways that reveal who we really are as a people, then make sure you are subscribed to Cradle of Democracy. Every week, we go deeper into the stories that American history textbooks flatten out and simplify, and sometimes quietly get wrong. There is a video right there about another founding myth that turns out to be far more complicated than anything you were taught in school. Click it. You will not regret it. The British were not coming. The regulars were out. 3 men rode that night, not 1. And now, at last, you know all 3 of their names.